Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Presentation Matters, our CROSH webinar on slide design. So just to start off, everyone can hear me okay. I can't see you, but the chat is active. So if at some point my voice drops out or the visuals go wonky, just shoot me a message in the chat and I will see that. So we'll be talking for about 35 minutes or so today, and then we'll have time for some questions at the end. So who am I? My name is Tobi Mankis. I'm the Communication Development Officer at CROSH. And through CROSH, I help with science communication and representing our science visually. I've got a master's in science communication from Laurentian University, and I'm also a sessional lecturer for the science communication program, also here at Laurentian. So before we really kind of dive into things, I want you to take a minute and think about a really good presentation you've seen. Maybe it was recently, maybe it was a little bit in the past, and think, what did you like about it and what made it effective, right? And now maybe think about a presentation you didn't like so much and what didn't work for you about that presentation. Okay, now I want you to keep those in your mind as we kind of go through, and maybe kind of as a base from which we'll be building on. So to start off, I want to iterate that our goal through planning and slide design is to effectively communicate with our audience. And so aesthetics are nice, they're plenty important, but the main goal in slide design is effective communication and making sure our audience walks away with the message that we want them to walk away with. And so our plan for today's webinar is we're going to talk first about the planning process. Then we're going to go over some design learning principles. And then we're going to just talk some tips and tricks and things that you might want to incorporate into your future presentations if you think they're helpful. So just to give some scope of how we should see our presentation and the audience journey we're taking them on is, so we've got our audience before the engagement, and this is kind of, so they've got their prior knowledge, right? And then through our presentation, we want to inform or persuade or inspire our audience to some behavior or understanding or knowledge, right? And so that's the overarching journey that our audience is going on. And I'm saying audience a lot because it's really important that we understand who our audience is. So this is a really great quote that Nancy Duarte uses in her book, and it's from Ken Hamer. And I love this quote. It's, designing a presentation without an audience in mind is like writing a love letter and addressing it to whom it may concern, right? It just doesn't work. And so it's easy for us to convince ourselves that we're the star of the presentation. Like, I'm the one who's talking right now. It's my face on the advertising template, but really you're the reason this presentation is happening. And so you're the stars, and it's my job to convince you that what I'm telling you today is worthwhile. And that's the same for any presentation. The audience is always the star. And so it's important that we recognize that, and also that we start to understand who our audience is. And yes, we can group our audience. That yes, your audience today is the people that signed up for this webinar. But even a single audience isn't the same. It's not a homogeneous group. So just think of when you're presenting to, say, like a lab group. If you're a student, you'll have peers, you'll have more senior students, you'll have your supervisors as co-supervisors. And so what we need to do is we need to determine the person or subgroup we most need to influence in our audience. And that doesn't mean we exclude like the rest of our audience. It just means that when we're fine tailoring and tuning our presentation, we've got a very specific target audience in mind. And once we do that, we can start planning our presentation according to our audience's unique characteristics. And so when I say characteristics, I mean things like their prior knowledge. Everyone comes to a presentation having experienced life in some way. And so I'm sure all of you have given many presentations before, and you've probably seen even more. And so that's part of your prior knowledge for this presentation. The prior knowledge could also be formal education. Or am I talking to a group of PhDs? Or am I talking to people who don't have a PhD education? We can talk about like cultural knowledge. We can talk about lived experience. I mean, someone who's been driving a scoop tram for 10 years knows a lot of things that I don't know, even if I've got a background in occupational health and safety. We also want to think about our audience's familiarity and trust. How likely are they to see me and my organization as a trusted source of information? And if not, how am I going to work out ways to build that trust? We also want to consider the values and priorities of our audience. And so this could be things like family. They really, family is most important to them. Or, if it's a manager, it could be fiscal responsibility. It could be safety. It could be, I'll give an example. We've been working on a lot of vaccine confidence work at CROSH. And when we talk to our stakeholders, talk to community members, we said, what do people really value in your Northern Ontario workplaces? And they said community. And so, okay, so that's a value that we can then make sure we build into everything we produce for this project is understanding that that's what people value. They value community, and that's how we're going to influence them. And then we also want to talk barriers to engagement. So this could be accessibility or other things that would get in the way of people really engaging with my content that I'm trying to present. And so once we kind of understand our audience and we start thinking about how am I going to tailor my presentation to this specific audience, then we can start thinking, okay, what are my actual objectives? What do I want to attain through this presentation? And so we can kind of break down objectives into three broad types. We've got our informed objectives. What do I want my audience to know or remember? We've got relational objectives. And so like, what kind of relationship do I want to build? Do I want this to be a multi-year relationship of trust with this audience? So how am I going to attain that through my presentation? And then we've got behavioral objectives. And this is especially true for occupational health and safety, is like, what do we want? How do we want our audience's behavior to change after this presentation? What safe actions do we want to incorporate into their daily schedule? So we need to identify those objectives so we can make sure we're working towards achieving them. And to that end, every presentation needs an essential message. And when I say essential message, I mean this is like the one sentence from your presentation that you want your audience to walk away understanding. You can call it your big idea or your key message. And another way to think of it, I kind of see it as like an essay thesis, or sorry, an essay thesis statement for your presentation, right? And it's not so much, you're not necessarily going to give your essential message to your audience, but you're going to use that as you build your presentation and making sure that everything you have in your presentation supports that essential message, supports that thesis statement. And if it doesn't support it, then maybe it doesn't belong in the presentation. And so you can kind of build a presentation, an essential message into two parts. So we want to cover like what you're researching, what did you find, or what you're proposing, and then why it matters to the audience, or the action taken to the audience. And so I'll give you an example just to kind of show you what a real world essential message could be. So we need to restrict commercial and residential development in Ontario's Greenbelt because we're destroying the fragile ecosystem there and killing off endangered species. Okay, so we've got kind of the what we want our audience to walk away with, and the why it's important to them, why they should be motivated to know this information. Now, the essential message can absolutely and should change for different audiences. So, here I'm talking about the why is the fragile ecosystem and endangered species. But if I'm talking to, say, a land developer or someone who's more fiscally motivated, we need to restrict commercial and residential development in Ontario's Greenbelt because the loss of ecosystem services is estimated to be valued at $500 billion. So both those, whys are true, but we're just framing it different to connect with that specific audience. And so we can use this essential message also as a filter, right, to eliminate options and to make choices for our presentation. So when we start off, we're coming up with ideas, we know who our audience is, we're thinking, and we're like, okay, we can talk about so much different things, but then we develop our essential message and we whittle that down to only the core information that supports our essential message that our audience will walk away with. Okay, so that's kind of all I want to talk about today about the planning. And now I want to jump into some of the design and learning principles that kind of go into multimedia learning. So I'm going to start with a real world example of why design and proper consideration of design is so important. So this example comes from NASA. And some of us will remember this happening, but back in 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia was getting prepped to launch. And as part of this prep to launch, there's all kinds of safety reviews and presentations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a real slide that was presented from the debris assessment team to the mission evaluation team. And this is from the actual NASA government report. So I think we've all seen slides that kind of look like this, and maybe we've made them ourselves in the past. But so if we're looking at the slide, take for a second, I want you to decide for yourself, what do you think the most important bit of information is to pull out of this slide? What do you think above anything else you want to understand? Is it this part here? Probably not. But that's the most important piece of information. And that wasn't conveyed to the mission evaluators. And we know that the Space Shuttle Columbia ended in a fatal disaster, killing all 7 crew members. So obviously, I'm not suggesting that poor slide design caused the Columbia disaster, by no means, but it was one of myriad of factors. And part of the bureaucracy and culture of NASA is when they did was very bureaucratic slide design, and information didn't go up and through the proper channels. And so this is an example of visual hierarchy. So when we saw all those bullet points nested in amongst each other. And so when I say visual hierarchy, what do I really mean? Well, take a look at this. Right, and I bet you it worked for most of you that you read exactly what I said you're going to read first, and so on. And so it matters how we orientate and show our text. It matters size and position and contrast. Okay, and we're going to get more into some more design principles, but I want to take a quick look at kind of the 3 broad types of slide design before we go any deeper. Because I think it'll kind of help ground us a little bit. So there are 3 kind of broad types of slide design. When I say slide design, it's something really you're making with Keynote or PowerPoint or something along those lines. And so the first, you can make a document in PowerPoint. It's mostly text. It's maybe got a little figure, and these can be great for handing out, if it's a live presentation, handing out the beginning, paper copies, or handing out, emailing before your presentation. It's a document meant to be kind of read over at the leisure of the audience. And then probably the more common type of slide design we see is kind of called the teleprompter slide. And in this case, we've got our header, and then we've got a bunch of bullet points supporting that. And often in lectures when we're teaching, we do this because it's quick, relatively quick, gets some points across, allows students to take notes. So it does have its purpose, and it's kind of like the default go-to. But if we really want to have effective slide design, we really want to make the most out of the presentation, make it a real presentation. And so that's what we're going to be talking about, is how we can make these slides, effective visual aid to our message, and where the focus, stays on the presenter. Visuals are not a distraction. And so the con with this is, the presentation takes a lot longer to do than just like the teleprompter. But it does have a bigger payoff. So you kind of have to weigh those 2 aspects. And so getting back into the kind of the principles and kind of how we should think about designing slides is most important one, I think, is we need to do the cognitive heavy lifting for our audience. And this is kind of the touchstone of all points when I'm talking to my students, or when I'm thinking about what slide I'm showing. It's we need to do the hard work for our audience, and so their brains can be tuned to our message that we're getting across. I don't want them trying to spend brain power trying to decipher fonts or images. I want them thinking about the content and the message I'm trying to influence them. And so the whole reason slides are so great is because people learn better when language is combined with images. We're talking about, orange squares, and we're showing images of orange squares. And because of how our brains work, when language is combined with images, we tend to learn better. Okay. And of course, we've got a name for this. This is called the multimedia principle. It also ties into like the dual coding principle. But when we combine language and images, we're kind of maximizing retention and understanding for our audience. And we can do this because our brains process visual and language information independently. Now, they process it, they store it, and that's great. Images supporting each other. And the point is, I should say that the images and languages need to obviously support each other. If I'm talking about an orange square and I'm showing you an image of a blue triangle, there's going to be a disconnect in your brain. So as we said, brains process visual and language information independently, and this is called the dual coding principle. Okay, and this is from Pavillo, and he was he's got a very cool story that I recommend you check out another time, but he's a Canadian researcher. So yes, we've got visuals, we've got language, this is great, but because the brain processes like audio language and like read language, so like reading text in the same part of the brain, written and spoken words will compete for your audience's attention. Okay, and this is called the split attention effect. And I think we're all kind of generally aware of this, is that, if people are reading your slide, they're not listening to you. And vice versa, if they're listening to you, they're not reading your slide. And so we need to take this into account when we're designing things, that we're not expecting people to be splitting their brains in two and doing two separate tasks at the same time. So we want to be careful about that. And we might think, okay, well, what if I just throw a wall of text up and I'll just read it? Okay, so everything's in support of everything. They can either listen to me or they can read my slide. But unfortunately, people learn less when identical information is presented in two or more ways. Okay, so if they're seeing something and hearing like the exact same identical thing, believe it or not, people will learn less. And this is called the redundancy effect. And so we can't just get away with throwing a wall of text and speaking about it, or even paragraphs of text, and hoping that people, by seeing it and hearing it, will understand better. We want to combine visuals with our spoken language. We also want to keep our slides simple. We can talk about like signals versus noise ratios. So it shouldn't be a surprise that anytime we remove extraneous information, people are going to learn better. And yes, psychologists have tested this, and yes, there's a principle for it, and this is called the coherence principle. I don't think it's a particularly good name for the principle, but I think we can understand that the more simple a slide, the more people are going to easier connect with your message. And to that point, and this is probably the one question I get asked most, by my students or by other people is, how many slides should I have for my presentation? And the answer is the number of slides is completely irrelevant. What's important is the number of ideas per slide. And so we want to try and show one idea per slide. Okay, it makes it easy to talk about, but more importantly, it makes the audience right on board. We know exactly where their brains are at. They're on the one idea we're talking about, and it also removes all that extraneous information. And so there's actually a process or an approach to building slides that takes into account many of the principles and effects that I just talked about, and it's called the Assertion Evidence approach. And this was developed at Penn State by a number of researchers, electrical engineering education researchers there. And I'm a big fan of it, and I hope you will be too. A lot of my students, once they learn about this, they're like, oh, this is how I want to do presentations from now on. And it's a very straightforward, it's very easy to understand. And all assertion evidence is you make a very descriptive assertion sentence, kind of near the top or somewhere on your slide. And then you have a visual evidence supporting that assertion. So there's no bullet points, there's no wall of text. We've got assertion and text, and then visual evidence. As an example, this is a slide presented in the assertion evidence manner. And what's the slide doing? It's actually the real world data for why assertion or how assertion evidence works. And so I grabbed the raw data from the paper, so it doesn't have error bars or anything like that. But we can see, people learn better using this assertion evidence. So where we've got the descriptive assertion title, or like followed by the image on the slide, vice just title and a bunch of bullet points. People learn better with assertion evidence. And to give another example, it doesn't necessarily need to be a graph. I just pulled this slide from one of my class slides, and so this is kind of the traditional slide you'll see, where we've got a title and we're showing something. Instead of let's not do that. Let's do assertion evidence. Increased brain activity is observed when participants consume media structured in a certain story format. Right? Assertion evidence, and you can apply this to many different things. Right, and so those are kind of the principles and kind of the philosophies behind kind of slide design that we can factor in to what we're thinking about. And for the last third of our presentation, I want to talk tips and tricks and just kind of some more granular level details of what I found works, what doesn't work, and either if it's not based on personal experience, it's based on the evidence. And so the first question, I think this is Hamlet who said this, is to template or not to template. And templates are okay, I think, for inspiring ideas on color combinations and visuals, but they're dangerous because they're loaded with all that extraneous elements. And that's why I recommend, for me, I build everything from scratch, because that way I know everything that's on the page, or sorry, is on the slide, is there for a reason. So for example, here we've got, we've all seen, we've probably made slides that kind of look like this. We've got a graph, we've got bullet points, we've got all kinds of information that we're throwing at people because we want them all to have it. And it also makes it a little bit easier because it's all in one slide. And it's based on a template, and that template looks cool. But how effective is this getting our message across? How effective is the audience understanding the figure we want them to understand? And so, okay, so let's take one more step and just, let's remove the template and see what this looks like. Oh, okay. So already I think we're seeing this is a little bit better. We can even see, okay, this figure's about global temperature. I don't know if we could tell that immediately from all the noise and chaos of our template slide. And then we can do even better than this. Okay, so why don't we make our, figure full screen? I mean, slide is, it's free. We're not, we can have as many slides as we like. So let's make full use of the real estate and really expand our figures. And this way, the audience is engaging with them. They're not trying to cite them through all the extraneous information. And then you can also walk through the figure step by step if it's particularly complicated to help your audience understand them. So the example I'm giving is not complicated, but it can kind of show you that if you've got a complicated figure, something you can do. So I'll start off with showing just kind of the base layer of the figure. Okay, so I'll introduce it Siberians eat more blueberries and apples in the summer months. Along the bottom, we can see our months, and on the y-axis, that's compared to servings eaten per household. And then I can introduce a little bit of the data. So now we're looking at the number of apples eaten by month, and we can see, okay, it remains fairly constant over the spring and summer months. But then when we compare that to blueberries, we can really see that blueberries start to increase, and our catch-up point is June 15th, and that's when Siberians eat more blueberries and apples. So this is not actual data. Please don't take this to the bank. I made up some numbers and I chose apples and blueberries. But I just want to show that you can do this for your figures if you've got a complicated figure. And it takes time to do, but you can walk people through bit by bit. And even if you're not able to break your figure down and reveal it bit by bit, you can even just do give us the base, then talk about the data, and then finally add a little thing for the highlight, the main point, like a little point that you want them to take away. And so we can do the same thing for our text as well. We reveal the points one at a time as we talk about them. And I think you've probably seen me doing this already in this presentation. So we have, this is point 1, and now we have point 2. And lastly, you're reading point 3. And so by doing it this way, I make sure that I'm, one idea at a time, one idea per slide. And I like to fade out my previous points just so the audience has like a touchstone, but I fade them out so that, I know that where their attention is at. And on that note, there's often a better alternative to bullet points. I mean, yeah, bullet points, they get the job done, but like we say, it's, there's maybe a better way to engage our audience. And so this is an example made by the person who taught me slide design, and it's a really good example, so I'm going to use it here. And so we can see, we've seen, and we've made slides that look this, types of mind waste, and we have our bullet points, and we have our nice figure, like image along the side. And this is, I think, we see this a lot, and I see this with my students a lot. This is kind of where we tend to gravitate because we've seen these types of slides. But with a little bit more effort on our part, I think we can make something that really connects with the audience better and lets them walk away with our message. And so, okay, let's make that figure full size, use the full image, and then why don't we do something like this? Here it works because we've got waste rock in this part of the map, tailings here, acid waste, dry tailings, and slag. So I think it's a pretty straightforward example, but and smelter. But it shows bullet points are yes, they work, but we can often find a better way to get our message across to our audience. And on that note, we really need to make sure our text is easy to read and to understand. So, for example, don't do this. We don't want Comic Sans orange on black backgrounds, or this, like the pirate font. It's fun, but it's a little bit more hard to read. Same thing here. I think we want to do the cognitive heavy lifting for our audience. And so if we're getting too fancy and crazy with our fonts, that's going to be a barrier between us and our audience. And in terms of font types and there's kind of 2 broad groups of fonts that we can think about. And I'm sure many of you already know this, like there's sans serif and serif fonts. And so as a general rule, sans serif fonts tend to work better on screens than serif fonts. And so sans serif just means it doesn't have like the little dangly bits like the below text has. And it just serif work is pretty good for print, but sans serif is a little easier on the eyes, or at least it looks a little nicer. And so I tend to recommend that my students use this, and I like to use a sans serif font. And on that note, we need to make sure that our font and our colors have enough contrast to be easily readable. And this is really important, not only if someone is colorblind, but even just for the general for any audience member. So when I ask how well can you read this, I'll ask you that right now. Like, can you read that in that lime green square? Well, is that easier to read? Probably. And so what's the difference? Well, obviously white and black, but really what I'm getting at is it's the contrast ratio. And I'll show you, the next slide will show you where you can find this, but like we want a contrast ratio of about 4.5 to 1 for regular text. So this black on that green, oh, we're hitting that. That's fantastic. That's easy to read. The white and the green, not so much. And so when in doubt, black font on white screen, that's going to have maximum contrast. Great. But we can sometimes have, be more engaging than that. And to check it, this is, I would say just Google color contrast checker, and there's tons of them. The Adobe one is pretty good, but there's many of them out there, and you just enter in your colors. And so sometimes they'll ask for like the color code, but other times you can just actually upload an example, and it'll tell you, are your colors contrast enough to be easily readable? And this is especially good if we're, for designing for accessibility and people who are red, green, or other types of color blend. And when in doubt, make your text size larger. It's going to vary per application, per audience, per room. Are you presenting on Zoom? Are you presenting in person? For my class this year, I went in beforehand tested out the projector and decided, okay, I can't use anything smaller than font 40 for my students to be able to properly see it from the back of the room. Now, obviously, we're not always going to have access to the room that we're presenting in, but when in doubt, make your text size larger. Again, like we've got infinite number of slides to play with. Let's make use of the space. We want our audience to easily read our text. When it comes to images, we can be sloppy, right? We can throw things in as kind of like a collage, and yeah, that's okay. But we can put a little bit more work into it, and if we want to show all 4 images at the same time, okay, we want to make sure they're in a nice grid pattern, they're aligned well. That's not only more aesthetically, it's more aesthetically pleasing, but people aren't going to be distracted by kind of trying to figure out the orientation of the images. Yeah, so I can see there'd be reasons why you'd want to have 4 images on screen at once, but most of the time, I bet you're better off to like go full screen. So we could throw a caption on it, like some assertion evidence. Submarine mining operations employ thousands of people, or we just have an image of the big nickel, and we talk to the image. And so everyone's probably seen like TED Talks, right? And this is what they do. They fill the screen with their images, and absolutely, it makes it much more engaging. It pulls the audience right into your presentation. Okay, and so today we covered planning, design and learning principles, and we went over some tips and tricks. And so what I want you to remember is that we want to keep our slides as simple as possible. We don't want the visuals to compete with our speech for attention, so we want them to work in harmony together. We do want to avoid templates. As tempting as they are, they're just going to add those extraneous elements. We're going to go full screen, like whether that be, especially for images. Let's make full use of the screen. Go TED Talk and make it super engaging for our audience. I recommend breaking down your figures in 3 steps: background, data, highlights. And again, this is going to vary based on your audience, how much you're going to do this. If it's one PhD to another, you can take shortcuts, obviously, but for most audiences, it's really going to help for you to really just walk people through your figures and your data. And the same applies for text. We bring things up as we talk about them, and then we hide them when we're done with them. And so we know exactly where our audience is looking and paying attention to at any given moment. We want to aim for 1 idea per slide, and not only for our presentation, but actually the 1 idea per slide is actually a really great way when you're building your presentation. And so what I like to do, and other people like to do, is write like the 1 idea message. So what point do I want to get across, and I'll write that out in a full sentence, and I'll put that on a slide. And then I'll do that for all the points I want to talk about in my presentation. And then I can start, shuffling them around in PowerPoint and Keynote to figure out my logical order. And then I can start, fleshing out and building up from just that point. So it's a great planning tool. But then at the end of the day, when we're presenting to our audience, we want to have that 1 idea per slide. And I'll even put that big and bold because that's a huge takeaway. Yes, we're doing the cognitive heavy lifting. That was one of my big takeaways, but we want to aim for 1 idea per slide. And the whole point of this is about effective communication. Aesthetics are nice, aesthetics are great, but if our audience isn't walking away with our essential message in their brains, we really haven't, achieved our objectives. And so at this point, I'd like to open up the floor to questions. We'll have 12 minutes for questions, and you can just write them in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them. Oh, great. Hi, Paris 2. Paris 2 is asking, is there any relationship between the background color, so not contrast, and type of presentation or kind of presentation? Yeah, so that's, you can have some kind of fun with that in the sense of, yes, you can do like associate it with like an organization. So if your organization has like a certain color that you want to pull into, you can kind of throw that as your background. And also, I guess, in terms of the seriousness of the presentation as well. I mean, obviously, if you're going like just plain white background, that's a certain formality. Well, as opposed to a black background, which I find works well when you're kind of showing off images. But yeah, that's a great question. Hopefully that answered that, Pierce too. Okay. Oh, lots of great questions. So I'm going to go through them one by one. Okay. Let's see. So I've got. So we got a question from Rebecca. So what's the best way to cite information on slides without looking at overly messy? So that's going to depend, obviously, on like if you're doing it for school, it'll depend on what your professor wants. What I do, let's see if I can do this without breaking things. Get back to where I've cited something. I do, and I tell my students to do. Sorry, this was a dumb way to do it. Just looking for an example. So I do author and year. That's how I cite, and that's how I ask my students to cite. But again, it's gonna vary based on what it is. But I find that's the cleanest way to do it, and then you can provide that detailed references later. Okay. So great question from Reza. Do we have any sites for your page when we can get original images, slides, etc.? Yeah, so that's a great question. And because we really don't want to plagiarize our images. I know we know that for text, but images super important that we've got the rights for that. So what I do for images, there's a site called Pixabay, Pixabay.com. And so that's a great free one. You can also, when you do like a Google search, you can kind of break it down further and only search for Creative Commons images, or you can go to like Wikimedia Commons. But yeah, it's super important that you use in your images that you've got the rights to those images. So I'll finish going through the Q&A here. And so this is from Brent. So no templates, but what about slide numbers so that the audience can refer to particular images, graphs during a Q&A? Yeah, so that's a good point, Brent. I tend to not use them personally because I find the audience starts to thinking, oh, I'm only halfway through this presentation, or I've only got that much further to go. But that you do raise a good point about making it easy to reference it. So and to be honest, I hadn't thought of that for that Q&A part. So I think that's a really good point. Yeah, so especially if it's like, if you've got a Q&A, maybe it is a good idea to have slide numbers so that the audience can refer to a particular image during Q&A. That's something I hadn't thought of. Because I do tend to avoid like using slide numbers. But yeah, that's a really good point, Brent. Okay, so here we are back in the chat, and so Eric Larson, yes, they're saying most often less verbiage than better on the side. Yeah, absolutely. We want to cut back as much text as possible. And again, if we're teaching a lecture, it's going to vary on who we're talking to. But since you're hearing my voice, I would say cut back on that verbiage as much as you can, and 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a much more effective slide, I think. Okay, great question from George. So PowerPoint's got this new thing where it says like design ideas, and it's pretty clever in the sense of how it like builds your content and like gives you options for designing it. So George is asking, do I recommend we use that feature? I would say no. To be honest, you can be inspired by it, and honestly, sometimes I'll turn it on and I'll like, oh, that's a neat way of showing that, but I wouldn't turn it on because it locks you in too much. And oftentimes I find for those kind of templates, they just take up so much real estate with just shapes and colors that don't build your content. So I would not recommend using the design ideas, but absolutely you can check it out to see and get inspiration from it, George. Does sharing videos in a presentation work? Does the presentation seem unprofessional? No, I think that can absolutely work. And it can be a great way to engage. And so of course it's that balance. You know, we don't want it all to be video because it's like, why did I even bother showing up? But we can actually absolutely share video. What I would recommend for that, Ivana, is really making sure you've got like the technical kinks worked out for that. Because that's where I find I always run into trouble, like audio or visual won't work. And so I'll have to like download it, embed it, and PowerPoint does it better than Keynote, I think, for videos. And so absolutely, I think it can be professional and can help reinforce your message. But that always comes with the risk of those technical glitches. And so that would be my caution for that. So from Andrew, most people need more detailed slides to help prompt them during the presentation, but also would you want your presentation to take the slides away so they have a record of the information you presented? Is it a good idea to have two versions of the slides, one for presenting and one for the audience to take away and help prompt you during the talk? Honestly, Andrew, yes, it is the ideal, if time was not an option, was to have, yeah, we have our assertion evidence, minimum text presentation that's highly engaging, people are learning better, but then we also want to do like a slide, kind of that handout document that we can also send people later at the same time to do. So the true answer is the hard one, that we do want to have two separate ones ideally, because they're doing two separate things. They're trying to achieve two separate kind of ways of kind of getting that message across. Okay, so Javad is asking, are shorter slides or longer slides, or how many slides are the standard? It's whatever you need to get your your essential message across. But Javad, I would say just one idea per slide. If you build from that, your presentation will be as long or as short as it was. So my presentation today was about 35 minutes, if my math is right. That's what I was aiming for. The number of slides I had, does anyone want to take a guess? I know I can't hear you, but I had 118 slides for my 35-minute talk today. And part of that is because I was revealing things bit by bit. Yeah, so it's one idea per slide and let everything else kind of fall out from there. And it'll be as long as it needs to be within the time limit that you're allotted for your presentation. Okay, let's see. I think we've got a few more questions here. Oh, a great point from Reza. The new PowerPoint, you can also use options to use various icons. Yeah, that's a great point. And Keynote too. That's kind of what I like. I know it's a maxing only. They've got some great icons too. Yeah, so absolutely, that's a really great point. Let's see here. Okay, so I think, does anyone else have any questions? I mean, I can talk about this literally for hours and hours. But I know everyone has to get back to work. So what I'll do is I will I will give a shout out in these last couple of minutes. So some good references, to check out if you want to learn more. So Nancy Duarte has some really great books out there. The Harvard Business Review's Guide to Persuasive Presentations, Slideology are great. A lot of the multimedia learning. So I did a lot of that for my master's, digging into that, but I referred back to the Cambridge Handbook of Multimedia Learning to make sure I got kind of understood the principles right. I'm going to be posting this up on the CROSH website later under CROSH.ca category events webinars, but you can also just search on the CROSH website. You can download this later. And if you're really, really into this stuff, there is a program at Laurentian that it's kind of the bread and butter, the science communication program. And so I'm a proud graduate, and they have a master's and a graduate diploma. So if you're really interested and you want to learn more, and they also sometimes do workshops. But at this point, I'd just like to wrap it up and thank everyone for coming out. Hopefully you found that useful. And if you've got questions, feel free to shoot me an email. And I really enjoyed the chance to talk with you today. So thank you very much, everyone. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoons.